Welcome to Great Power Politics. In today's class, we will move away from this more general theoretical understandings of power in the international system, where we are looking at power balances and distributions from a theoretical perspective. And in the second part, we are rather looking at concrete examples of regions as well as countries in the world, which are either rising powers, declining powers, or kind of staying stable across time in their power position. So we would like to look at the continuation of the power distributions of these different regions to see, kind of get a glimpse of what could be the international system within the future. And today we will start with the first rising power, which is maybe often seen as synonymous with any rising power in the world, and especially in East Asia, and that is China. So we will look at the one hand at the origins of the economic success of China, and also kind of look at its military kind of success, its increase in its power within the region, but also at its position as a challenger for the United States. But we don't only look at the kind of success story, if you will, in this way, but also look at very specific problems the country is facing in kind of prolonging this success into the future. And we will look here at regional distributions, at issues of poverty in some parts of the country, on issues of corruption and other kind of challenges which lie ahead, to get a good understanding where the opportunities but also where the challenges are lying. And then we would like to put this into context with the rest of the international system and what we can expect for the future. So I hope you will enjoy this class. Please stay tuned, and I will go right into the slides. Thank you. Today's Great Power Politics class is the rise of China to global power. In a way, a lot of people of you might think this is a premature kind of thought, that China rose already to global power. But what I would say is, like, if we kind of look at the last 40 years, from the beginning of it, after the Cultural Revolution until now, we can see, 40 years, actually 60 years, we can see that there has been considerable progress being made, and the country is becoming undoubtedly more powerful. But what I'm not saying in this is that actually China is already in the position where it is a global superpower, or whether it's a challenger for the United States. Having said, though, that in recent years, the US certainly perceives China as becoming more powerful, and certainly is also developing mechanisms to cope with the increased power of China. We will discuss this further in a couple of minutes, but basically it is undoubtedly true that the rhetoric which the current US administration under Donald Trump is taking is directly geared towards China, and directly seen as a competition, because China is directly seen as a competition on the global stage. But first things first, let's go a little bit back and see the economic revolution since I wrote here in 1976, but roughly you can say like the end of the 80s, the beginning of the 90 years. So in a way, what we do see is that China went, and without going into too much detail about the about the historic events and the cultural events, etc., etc. What we can say about the last 60 years of development, no, the last 40 years, I apologize, of development are that we had a real transition of China once it moved away from its more state-centric, market-planned socialist economy towards a market-driven, still state-centric, market-driven economy, which left a considerable freedom for entrepreneurship, as well as freedom for market mechanisms have been introduced into the Chinese economy. And what we do see there is that before we had like a real maybe economic low in terms of the aftermath of the Cultural Revolution, and therefore situations of hunger, situations of suppression, which kind of led to a failure of the planned market, the planned state economy. And it was opened to more and more over the decades towards a market economy, but a planned socialist, very specific market economy. Some of the aspects are, of course, that companies from abroad are welcome to do business within China, and that's gradually changed over time, but not, or at least until very recently, not without a kind of very strong cooperation with the Chinese company and under the supervision of the state. Overall, we can say that still, even if we are more or less in the mechanisms in China are very kind of close to what we call a market economy, but still the Chinese state has a very powerful position in it. State companies are among the strongest, most powerful companies, and even companies which are privately owned, not state owned, are under very close supervision and also under close restriction. So big companies, you might know Huawei or Alibaba, are privately owned, but at the same time, they're very closely connected to the Chinese state and under the supervision of it. Why this is important for China, we can discuss in a little while, but just from a factual perspective, this is where we are standing at the moment. So what we do have is a first, like a slow change in economic thinking in the beginning of the 1990s, and that led to a gradual market reform. So nothing. We shouldn't think of this as very unlike the Chinese Cultural Revolution, which was a very abrupt change of the economic model, the social model, etc., etc. So a very kind of severe, abrupt change. The introduction of market mechanisms hasn't been done in the same way. It has been done very cautiously and step by step. And in a way, kind of introducing it always with a specific Chinese twist. So, which was quite interesting because we have this gradual process versus previously this kind of radical process. And it seems that a gradual process was much more successful in this way. And what we do find actually is that from this point on, the Chinese economy grew, and it grew steadily. So that's the most important part. It grew constantly, more or less, with several smaller crises, and maybe a big crisis at the moment, but it grew constantly over time. And that is the first really important part. And we can see that on average until the last year, we do have more than 10, over the whole period, we have an average of more than 10% of growth, which is enormous. And especially because China is a very big country, of course, this kind of shows how much economic power the country is having.
Having said though, which we have to keep in mind as well, is that growth rates are always proportional to how big the economy overall is. So we did have, especially in the beginning, a very underperforming economy. So these growth rates were easier reached because it was trailing behind other countries, especially developed countries. But, and that is, I think, the second really important point, which I want to make from this slide, is that we didn't have a shock therapy like we had after the end of the Cold War in Eastern Europe, where countries quickly changed the political system, economic system, etc., etc. But rather we had a gradual system where gradual change occurred. Okay. The progress of the Chinese economy, of course, has to be seen within the size of its population as well. So this enormous population made it, at the one hand, a huge market, a huge domestic market. So Chinese domestically has a very big market to serve, but also it made it very attractive for companies from abroad to enter this domestic market. So it's not just that Chinese companies were able to produce for the domestic market, but also that this market has been seen as very important for foreign companies as well. And so, especially in the early 2000s, what we saw is that companies were worried about being left behind in terms of accessing the market in China, and therefore they were willing to make more compromises than they would usually make in terms of how much influence the state has, and also how much influence, how much the companies have to work together with other actors on the domestic level. So this is so what we do see here is that companies from abroad were also really attracted in working with Chinese company and be much more cooperative than they would have maybe been with other countries where they didn't have the same kind of situation and not the same kind of prospect of selling to such a big audience. This can be very visibly seen in the car companies, which like many of the big European car companies, as well as Japanese, went into joint ventures and with Chinese companies. This led actually to something which is often seen as a technology transfer from quite developed companies like very competitive companies in the Western market, which then had to cooperate with Chinese companies and transferred knowledge about their products, but also transferred knowledge about organization, about how to manage such large firms. And it's often kind of seen that this was kind of created a real head start for the Chinese economy, because they could actually tap into all this kind of knowledge, institutional knowledge, which was existent. The other things are, of course, we have to look at population, not only from this kind of market perspective, but also from a working perspective. So a population of 1.4 billion people constitutes also a large pool of labor. It's in total 1/5 of the world population, and should therefore also be seen as basically kind of generating 1/5 of the world's economic output. Also, the service area is, of course, also very big. Only Russia and Canada, two countries which are much more sparsely populated, are bigger. But the other aspect, which is also really interesting, is that only 10% of Chinese land is suitable for cultivation. But still, 60% of Chinese labor force is engaged in agriculture, which shows us that actually there is still a very big pool of labor available, which has not been necessarily tapped into. Let's kind of have a look at the transformation after the end of the Cold War. In a way, this kind of gradualism was very often seen, especially at the end of the Cold War, that China would move closer towards Europe, and that China would actually become very similar to a European country, gradually introducing, let's say, democratic rules of law, etc., etc. But what we do see is that this kind of path of gradualism is also kind of connected to something which is often called ideological pragmatism. So in a way, it is not driven in the same way as socialist reforms in terms of a strict kind of stringent ideology, which is overreaching everything and therefore dictates the path the country has to take, but it's seen as much more pragmatic. And the only kind of, no, not the only, but one of the golden rules of this pragmatism is that the power base of the Communist Party should be preserved, and that the kind of the institutional structure of the political part is untouched, while the economic part is very much kind of modeled along the lines of Western market economies, with the exception that the state has a much stronger role in this economy, in the Chinese economy, than it has in the Western democracies. In a way, this ideological pragmatism has often been called by people, especially like following Stiegler's idea, that it's the wisdom to know what they didn't know. In a way, this kind of gradual process led them to be careful, not to have unintended consequences or large unintended consequences, which might actually kind of create failure of the system or collapse in it. So this gradual process is often seen as a very big part of the success of the country. Another aspect is that workers actually regained a control of the land they were working on. That was in the Great Leap Forward, which followed the Cultural Revolution. That was one of the big problems, that the state actually tried to manage too much of the market and the economic activities of the individual farmers up to the level of the individual farmers, and that created a situation which was very difficult for the farmers to succeed in, because mismanagement and errors were actually kind of carried on to the micro level, and therefore created a big problems. And that was one of the issues which was addressed very quickly. So the freedom of the individual farmers, while they don't have necessarily own land, has increased dramatically in what kind of crop they produce and how to sell it, etc. But also that the fact that 60% of the Chinese labor force is still engaged in agriculture shows us something else, and I think that's important to understand as well. That is that the average farmer has only 1 acre of land, which is really small. I wrote here 2 acres. Even in India, India is not necessarily a prototype of efficiency in terms of agriculture. But for example, in the US, one farmer works 100 acres, so a much larger portion, a much larger section. So efficiency is quite low at the farming level. But it also shows us that there's a very big pool of human resources still available for the industry. So in a way, this kind of pool can be tapped into in order to develop the economy further and we might not see the same kind of problem of rising salaries and kind of competition over the workforce we have in many developing economies, because there is a very large pool of labor force still available. In a way, again, with something which came together with the idea of opening the economy, was abandoning the idea of autarky. Autarky is an idea that a country should be self-sufficient, that it should actually be capable of surviving without much of a trade. And especially on the lead up of the Second World War, and among communist countries in the 1950s, 60s, and up into the 70s, has been very popular, because it was seen as a way to reduce dependency on global market processes, as well as other countries which might actually have an intention to harm certain countries. So the idea of autarky was basically to kind of be self-sufficient, to be able to manage your economy yourself, and therefore not rely on others. But it has proven to be very wasteful in resources. And while China was maybe one of the few countries which could actually kind of pull through with this because of its huge size and its huge size of population, it still was inferior in terms of economic growth and development. And therefore was the abandoning of autarky was again a catalyst to develop its economy even further. So what I was describing beforehand about foreign companies getting an interest in the Chinese economy and being able to participate in it was only possible because these kind of very strict rules about the access of the market have been relaxed. An interesting part, and there is a challenge, not just for China, but has been a challenge for many developing economies, is that what is about free movement of labor? What we do find is, we talk about this at a later stage, that there is inequality within the country. Some regions are quite rich, and others, because they are already developed their economy successfully, kind of shifting from old agricultural modes of production towards more productive labor, industrialized labor force, and in some parts like Beijing and Shanghai, even towards high-tech economies. But that means that actually labor movement can become a big problem. Why is that the case? Well, because if people can earn more in another part of the country, they have an incentive to actually move to this part. And what we see in many countries around the world, which have developing economies, like in India, but also in Brazil, in Mexico, in Nigeria, and many kind of developing economies, we find that around these areas, which are often very big cities, around these areas we find more, we find issues of poverty, of over demand on housing, on over demand on sanitary facilities, services, traffic, etc., which become very problematic for these areas to manage. One issue how China got tried to prevent this is by introducing very strict domestic limitations of movement. So workers are not free to go anywhere where they could within China, but rather very kind of confined to their own areas. And if workers are needed, then they have the opportunity to actually move there. I can give you an own example how this was at least in the early 2000s, where I worked as an intern in Shanghai. Within Shanghai was one of these areas exactly where people were not allowed to move. And we had some friends from outside of Shanghai who wanted to come for a relatively short period and stay with us, also maybe doing odd jobs, etc. And these Chinese citizens, they had real problems staying with us. They tried to do this officially and couldn't at the end get any kind of agreement from the police that they could stay at our place for a short period of time, which I mean like maybe a week or maximum two, because that would already kind of infringe this idea of that labor or that people can move freely. And so we have to understand that China within it has a very kind of stringent form of a limitation of free movement. That might work in cases of China and get maybe some criticism, but it is becoming, of course, like if we think about democratic states, then this is not reproducible because there are like these limitations of freedom or might not be accepted in the same way. So, okay, if we kind of want to make this like picture perfect, we could say like Chinese routes to success. We can see like different things which are really important. This one I mentioned already, the what is called industrial reserve army. So lots of people who are not necessarily working yet in the industrial in the production of in industrial production, but which are kind of still accessible for this kind of work, and therefore wages are continued to stay low in this kind of category of people, and ensure that China is not as easily as other countries falling into what is called a middle income trap, that wages rise and that the production within the country becomes less attractive than it used to because the costs increase and increase in this way. The other thing I also briefly mentioned is this idea about joint venture. So if foreign companies went into China to produce there and produce for Chinese markets, then it was necessary for them to have a joint venture with Chinese-owned domestic companies. And that led to something which I have at the point below, this idea of, technology transfer, that actually these Chinese companies then were in a position to catch up with the knowledge of foreign companies relatively quickly, or not relatively quickly, but catch up with them and learn about the technology in itself, but also learn about institutional design, how companies are run, what kind of mechanisms are used, etc., etc. And that has been seen as a really important part. Joint ventures and technology transfer and knowledge transfer more broadly has been seen as a very important part. But at the other hand, what is also existent, and we should never underestimate it, is the level of competition within China. So there is a market economy existent where companies are competing against each other, and they are not necessarily safe if they are not successful. So it is different than a state-led economy where no competition exists and everything is planned by the state. There's still a control level on the state level, and the state is preferring certain companies, especially state-owned or very large companies, because they are kind of strategic partners. But at the same time, there is competition existent, and that is often attributed as a form why Chinese companies are actually becoming more and more competitive, also on a global stage. What do we see on this slide? I don't want to talk too much about this, but we see here as the gray scale, and with federal FDI is foreign direct investment. And what we can see, the gray lines, what we can see here is that they are actually from the 19th, sorry about that, from the 90s up are continually increasing. So foreign direct investment is often seen as a really important part for developing your economy. And not just in China, but in many other countries, is seen as a vital aspect. And we do see this in China as well. However, what we also see is something what is here in the red, and that is the annual increase of the state reserve. And that's rather unusual, because an important aspect is that many of the most successful Chinese companies are state-owned. And therefore, lots of the revenues are not necessarily kind of kept by their shareholders or redistributed among the population, but rather kind of put into the state reserve, and these kind of reserves then grow exponentially. This can be used for several things. So the first advantage of it is that, again, it is less there's less funding in circulation within the country, and that creates the situation that also the middle, what we called before, the middle income trap is less likely to start. Why? Because people don't, like, there's less to distribute, therefore wages can't rise in the same way. Even if there's competition over employees, they are not, it's not as severe as in other countries, because the competition cannot pay so much more as well. The other thing is that, of course, that the state reserve can be used in strategic terms for long-term planning of the country's economic, political strategy. So it can be used in order to build up the military. It can also be used to build up the economy strategically, like we have in the Road and Belt Initiative, or even in terms of crisis, to have sufficient funding available in order to circumvent and change kind of crisis. So this foreign this increase in the reserve was very important, because it gave the state lots of leverage in what they can do in kind of further developing the economy. So what do we see here? Well, we do see this is the growth rate on an annual basis, and we do see here that in the 1990s we had very high levels of growth rate. That is when really the strategy took off, and it was between 14 and 16%. Then, in a way, it went a little bit down, but around it, like the lowest level around 2000 was in 8%. And then we had another big increase on the annual level. Then there's what we see here is the financial crisis, and there was a crisis of the Chinese capital market as well, a steep increase as well. Sorry, and then but what we do have since then is gradually lower growth rate. And still, what are not included in the recent growth rate. So the last year's growth rate seemed to be not very good, because of the increased trade war with the United States and the tensions between the two countries. This year, of course, has been seen as quite, the first quarter especially has been seen as quite bad, because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And the COVID-19 pandemic on a global scale also reduces export business within China in the coming months, and so therefore it is basically probably it will be the worst year in the Chinese economy, as well as it is on a global scale at large. So we do have in the recent time less strong performance compared to from 1990 to, let's say, 2010. But having said that, even these kind of lower growth rates are well above what Western countries have in growth rates, and therefore are still kind of competitive. And we do see that China continues to catch up, even though if the steps, if you want, are a little bit smaller than they used to be. What we do see here is, especially, it has been often kind of called that China is becoming the workbench of the world. So we do see not necessarily that technology is developed in China, but rather that it is produced in China. That many Western companies are using their sophisticated sourcing mechanism and produce their products in the Chinese market, and therefore have, of course, higher revenues. There's continuous transfer of knowledge, and it means that China is actually producing these kind of goods, and therefore leads to a situation that they are supplying the world with products itself. What we do have in the last, let's say, 2 to 3 years is a stronger emphasis of the Chinese government to change the economy from this kind of production-based to knowledge-based, and trying to establish Chinese domestic companies which are world leaders in certain areas in order to kind of be competitors on a global stage. We have seen this incentive is quite high in terms of the car production, especially one now where we see a shift towards maybe electrifying the car industry. We have also seen very strongly this move in technology areas like the mobile phone technology, where Huawei, OnePlus, and Xiaomi are maybe just to name 3 companies, are increasingly pushing on the world market and trying to strongly compete with companies like Samsung or Apple or Sony. These were just some examples. You shouldn't take them as absolute here, of course. The other thing which we also see in the last 2 years, especially from under the leadership of the United States, but also from other European countries and Japan, is that there is a pushback on these companies. So, for example, Huawei has been in hot water for the last year or so because it supplies lots of the infrastructure for the 5G network in many countries, or was aiming to provide lots of the infrastructure for the 5G network. And now new security concerns are coming up, which wonder whether the integrity of these systems will be existent if they are provided by a systemic, often called a systemic rival, so a country which might have kind of different interest in the country they are supplying with these products. This has been disputed by Huawei as well as the Chinese government. It is undoubtedly true that the Chinese government and Huawei are closely connected, but there hasn't been any proof of this kind of collusion between the two parties in order to kind of have like backdoors in their technology, etc. So it is not clear whether this is a real concern, whether this is a strategic move of Western countries to support their own companies, which might be a little bit less competitive on the price, or what the real motives are is very difficult to see from the outside. But what we do know is that many products which are essential for our economy are produced in China, and therefore the dependency on this country is increasing. I wrote on this slide 70% of consumer goods in Japan are made in China. that's true, and but something which is maybe more where we can see this even stronger is in this current pandemic, that lots of the protection material like face masks and scrubs for hospitals, etc., are produced in China. And so if there is a severe disruption as with the onset of the pandemic happened, that can disrupt supply of these products, even if they are as simple as face masks, for several months on a global stage. So even now, it is in some countries around the world quite difficult to source any, especially high quality face masks, which are necessary for medical staff to use in the fight of COVID-19. And because there's decentralized production mechanisms are very sensitive to these kind of disruptions, and it's not possible to kind of quickly change these things and reproduce, let's say, products in Japan, Europe, or the United States. So we do see that I think it's quite visible at the moment that there is a growing dependency on China as a supplier of goods, not necessarily in developing these kind of goods, but in supplying these goods. So we have now talked a little bit about this kind of success story, the Chinese success story, in becoming a really important economic power. And what I would like you to think about now is to see, like, what do you think? How successful will China be in the next 10, 15 years? So will it become really this competitor to the United States? Will it overreaching, be powerful within Asia and maybe dictate Europe as well? Or will it kind of struggle with this position? What do you think are the what will happen, and also what are the reasons for it? What do you think are the kind of the driving factors behind it? So make a 5-minute break here, or make a 10-minute, make 5 minutes break, and write down for 5 minutes. Think about it and write down what you think are the factors of how successful China will be in the next 10 to 15 years. Thanks. Okay, welcome back. Now we talked a lot about the economy and the development of the economy. What I would like to focus on now is something different. And that is an interesting part, is this kind of equality and inequality in China. So why is that interesting? Well, especially if you think about the history and of the Chinese state coming out of a communist movement, then it is interesting how the country was able to kind of leave the institutional political structure as it is in place, and rather than this, kind of develop a different economic model, which has proven to be quite successful. But how successful has it been to kind of bring prosperity to the whole population? Is this something which is only benefiting a small group of the population, or is it something which really kind of makes everybody wealthier within China? And we can see an interesting, I like this slide here. What we do see here is a picture of the Gini coefficient until 2000, from 1965 to 2015. What we do find is it's a comparison between the US and China. There's a Chinese China doesn't really supply these figures, but the United Nations are providing this, and this kind of provides us with a trend of how these developed over the time. And for all of you, just to remind you what the Gini coefficient is, it's basically how equal the wealth of the population is within one country. And this value is between 0 and 1. Yeah. So 0 meaning that there is no difference between the individuals. Everybody has the same access to wealth. While at the other hand, a Gini coefficient of 1 means that all the resources, all the wealth is confined to one person. So we have this spread between 0 and and 1 as a measure of inequality. Well, if we have the number is lower, the higher the level of equality. If the number goes up, we see increased inequality. And just to give you an example here, what we do see is the trend between 1965 and 2015, the blue line of the United States, it actually went considerably up. What does that mean? Well, this actually means that inequality in the United States increased. And we have debated this like in the media. This has been debated very frequently that in the United States, the rich people become richer while the middle class actually kind of the wealth of the middle class is reduced. And so it doesn't really come as a big surprise that we had this this increase within the United States of the Gini coefficient. So society becoming less equal, more distribution of wealth. If we kind of look at China, it's actually quite interesting, and that is that in 65, the Gini coefficient was a little bit higher. It went actually down in the beginning of opening the market. So at that time, inequality got reduced. Well, why? Because actually at that point, what we did see was that this kind of completely non-functioning agricultural market was opened up, and the farmers were able to kind of decide their own crop, to see what could be farmed, etc. And therefore we're more successful. So on a grassroots level, equality became more because the poorest of the society actually were able to produce better. But the further we go, this trend is reversed, and what we do see here is actually an increase in inequality as we see higher levels of industrialization. And this kind of industrialization led to some areas in China becoming better off, and others less good off. Also depending on education, etc., more access to high-paying work is really depending also on the area where you live, and also kind of what kind of education you had, etc. So we have an increase, and we have even overtaking the United States in the beginning of the 2000s. And we have also in China a new class of super rich emerging, which are able to use the system for their benefit and become very, very rich within the system. You also see here there's there are official figures which are kind of different, which are kind of seeing a reversal of the trend. They're kind of different than the UN predictions. The way this is that we could maybe actually think that Chinese government sees this as a real concern, and therefore wants to kind of wants to also have curb the message in there. Why? Because of course, for a communist country to have very high levels of inequality might actually become really problematic on a domestic level as well. We do see this inequality has two different factors. The one is that the spread between the rich part of the population and the poor population becomes increasingly bigger, of course, but also on a regional level that there are big discrepancies. And I will show you this just on this slide. We do have certain areas where, especially around Shanghai and Beijing, where productivity is very high, and a big part of the individuals produce a high level of GDP. We then have other areas around the East Coast, Guangdong, Fujian, etc., which are in a very strong position, economic position in terms of production, etc. So these kind of East Coast places are very strong in terms of their production. However, we have a very big part of China, which is much less developed, where where the GDP per person is much lower. So productivity is lower. Also, income is lower in these areas. And that's kind of, especially here in Yunnan province, and it shows very much that this inequality within the country exists and is considerable. And so we do have very different kind of parts of performances depending on the region. This is not something which is unusual. If you look at the map of the United States, you will see the same thing, that there are some areas which around California in the west, and the East Coast, where around New York and more generally Boston, the whole East Coast, where productivity is very high, but in the central states, productivity on GDP is much lower. We can see the same issues in Japan, where these kind of central areas are really around the Tokyo, Yokohama metropolitan area is much stronger economically than, let's say, areas like Amori or Hokkaido. So we do have this this development in any kind of state, but the level how it is in Japan is extreme. In China is extremely high, and kind of shows falls into this aspect of the Gini coefficient as well.
Well, so the economic performance is really unequally distributed within China, and that, of course, can be seen as one of the big problems China has in its development. That actually it is not as egalitarian as many people might believe, and also as many Chinese might believe. So this is one of the big problems which can come up in the future, that there's an unequal economic development which leads to tension within the country. So one problem which comes along these lines is the issue of poverty. So many regions, especially in Xinjiang province and Yunnan province, etc., are really kind of are still very agricultural based, very poor, and in this way feel at the moment, or many people in the region feel that this is actually that the economic development had not necessarily been so beneficial for themselves. For this has been already in the last 5 years, China tried to address this by subsidizing regions, by subsidizing people, Also in terms of media attention, for example, saying things like letting the rich get rich first and then the poor come, the rest of us come afterwards, was a big kind of slogan, a little bit like this. So it's a very rough translation of it. And so the idea here is that really kind of that poverty will be limited or kind of reduced over time, as in a kind of a trickle-down economy. So the economic prosperity overall will become stronger, and therefore the idea is that this will kind of lead towards a trickle-down effect. But there are two problems with this. The one is that China, in terms of taking out a lot of the financial resources which are generated by the economic system and putting them into state reserves, is of course leading to the situation that there is not a high inflation in wages, and therefore actually this kind of prosperity of the working man, the working class, if you will, is not kind of in the same developing in the same way. The other thing is that once economic inequality becomes bigger, it's very difficult to kind of turn this back and create a more equal society. Again, why? Because if there is a group which is wealthier, they also often have better means of strengthening their position. So they have more political influence. They also do have means of maybe going abroad, studying abroad, acquiring skills which are not feasible for every kind of Chinese. So people who are from a poorer background might not have the same opportunities. And so in a way, wealth is manifesting itself. And one of the difficulties which can be perceived from this is that poverty might be kind of a situation where people, which kind of leads into dissatisfaction. And from a Chinese government perspective, in the worst case, maybe leads to political dissatisfaction. Having said that, at the moment, we do see kind of very locally people dissatisfied with the political system, and of course minorities dissatisfied with the political system, but not necessarily like a very big movement which is kind of against the current political development. One kind of problem which is closely related to this idea of poverty is also the issue of corruption. So while economically the market economy, actually the wages increased, and also especially in the rich centers, people became wealthier and some form of middle class has been created. This doesn't really often kind of translate into the forms of in the police and also in other state actors. But one thing they do have is that they have a high level of power to make actually decisions. Local actors of the Communist Party, more local leaders, police, also regional actors, etc., are quite powerful in kind of agreeing to economic proposals. Also, they have a lot of freedom in their kind of rulings, and so there is a high temptation for corruption within by these actors. So we do see this. There's another issue, and that is that there is basically a complete lack of transparency. You might think that this is
an issue which could be changed by the government, but there's not necessarily kind of the interest in creating a completely transparent system. Why? Because if it's so transparent, then it's, of course, this information needs to be accessible for everybody. And if it is accessible for everybody, then it can be judged differently. So the state in itself doesn't necessarily want to have a transparent system where mismanagement, corruption, etc., is visible to everybody, because their aim, their worry might be that this is kind of eroding the trust into government and into the states overall. So this is a good ground for creating corruption, and it has been kind of said that corruption in China is actually endemic. It is not very easy to see what the real level of corruption actually is, because in the very nature of corruption, it is hidden, and it only comes out if there are real movements against it, and this kind of makes it public. So we don't necessarily know. There are assumptions about this, and there are even kind of indices which try to measure it, etc. But all of this is not very reliable. However, another interesting aspect is that Xi Jinping made this anti-corruption development as something which, as his kind of one of his signature policies. And it was also developed within this framework to kind of eradicate corruption, or at least kind of limit it. However, it was also used as it was a very convenient political tool as well. So any kind of opposition or opponent to policies of Xi Jinping or any of his close allies could be labeled corrupt and kind of prosecuted within this kind of corruption. And because there's no kind of independent rule of law, and not necessarily transparency, which kind of shows what kind of charges are there and how valid they are. And this was a very convenient tool to get rid of political actors as well. So poverty leads in sometimes cases to corruption. There was also high crime corruption, of course, of party leaders, which kind of got enormous sums. So this is the kind of high level of political power, a kind of and lower level of transparency leads to this kind of temptation. Especially at the end of the Cold War, one idea in the West was that developing that China will, with its opening its market, will become more complex. It will become, interests will become more heterogeneous, and actors will kind of be tempted, not just taking a free market and market economy, but also kind of lead towards maybe a gradual democratization of the political system within China. So this was the hope that over time, from a Western perspective, over time, the Chinese system would become more open, more transparent, more based on the rule of law, and in subsequently maybe more democratic. However, that didn't happen, and actually maybe the exact opposite happened. So we see a more authoritarian system, and then the Xi Jinping, we see the group of decision makers is actually becoming smaller, and the ones in the decision-making positions become more powerful. And of course, in the top of this, Xi Jinping is becoming a very powerful leader within China, towards the inside, but also towards the outside. It's also, we can also see that dissidents and people who are critical of the political system get much stronger repressions. And okay, what do we see here on this picture? Of course, this was the iconic picture of the Tiananmen massacre, where students try to protest for democracy and got got brutally shut down, and many people get killed, and even more injured, and the whole kind of movement was scattered after this and prosecuted. People were put in prison, etc. So this kind of and actually until today you should not talk about the Tiananmen massacre within China. They try to suppress any information about this kind of movement. So what we do see is that like tendencies of critics of the critical voices of the system are there, but they're systematically suppressed, and these kind of voices are also more and more in danger. We also see there's also an interesting development, especially as we see in the current situation of Hong Kong. China is also trying to promote its one country, a policy of one country, which means one China policy is, I think it's called, which basically means that there's maybe one, or the other slogan here is one country, two systems. That Hong Kong is actually a different political system, but belongs towards China. And what we have seen in this is that there's more and more dissent about how within Hong Kong, especially among students, how the Chinese government is intervening in Hong Kong politics and curbing Hong Kong freedoms. And so in this way, what we do see is that conflict is arising, but not necessarily in mainland China, but maybe in Hong Kong and among students there. It already shows how difficult it is to cope with this authoritarian system. So the question, one idea which is often promoted within China is this: political reform can be substituted by economic growth, that people will maybe not necessarily ask for a change of the political system and for legitimacy based on elections and choice if the political system is economically performing well, is providing increased growth and therefore increased wealth of the country and the people living in the country. So there is the idea that maybe this is kind of leading to it, but that is also one key issue, and that is that it's really kind of economic performance and economic growth needs to be there all the time. And one question is, like, if we are leading towards a more economic stringent situation, would it also lead to a more political to a situation where critique on the politics of China would maybe become more visible. Having said that, of course, there are like mechanisms within China to suppress any dissent information and actively use propaganda to promote other issues. So it's not necessarily true that this is coming up, but maybe, of course, if the system would like to perform its kind of justify its legitimacy over economic prosperity, then if we have no economic prosperity or less economic prosperity, this would be a problem for the system. The one worry is that institutional reform would actually limit the one-party system. And so anything which is leading to a more pluralistic idea is seen with suspicion and very often suppressed by the government, because one of the key aspects is that it should not lose its own power position. So what we do see is that overall political reform has been very limited, especially except maybe some certain targets which have been shifting, but the political reform in itself has been very limited, but economic reform has been much stronger. So the question here is, this is raising it. So the current economic situation with the COVID-19 pandemic, and in the background, the Chinese-US trade war is, of course, becoming unquestionably more challenging also in China. So the question is very much, and I think you should maybe think about this yourself as well, is very much like, what kind of consequences does this have for China? Does it have any consequences for the Chinese stability? Does it have any consequences for Chinese power position, etc.? Do we have a changing position at the moment, or will China continue in its and going from strength to strength and continue with its development? As I mentioned, we do see a trade war since the start of the Bush administration, the Trump administration. This kind of conflict between US and China in terms of economic development and trade has become more visible. Having said that, this is nothing new. So it's not that the policy of the United States or the goals of the policy of the United States changed significantly from the Obama administration towards the Trump administration in the United States, but rather that the form was changed. So while Obama was thinking much more about a multilateral form of containment of the Chinese power within the region, Donald Trump is focusing more on a bilateral competition between the two parties, the two states, and therefore sees as a more conflictual position. This kind of this is more visible to the general public, but not necessarily kind of a change in the overall policy itself. We can say from this trade war that it has had an effect on both countries. So the United States had an effect of this trade war, and like a negative economic effect. China has certainly had a negative economic effect of this trade war, and we do see that both sides actually kind of are not kind of started this when they had economically very prosperous situations, but in the new environment, in the post pandemic environment, their positions might change a lot, and we will. I'm not sure in which direction it will go, but this the current COVID-19 crisis will have a big impact on this. So we have to see, of course, in this way also the background of this current crisis, which coincidentally started in Wuhan in China and then spread around the world, which in a way it kind of, we do see very mixed messages about the position of China within this framework. At the one hand, especially in the very beginning, there has been large criticism about maybe domestic mismanagement of this crisis, and not necessarily kind of seeing the severeness of it, and therefore kind of having inadequate reactions. But then once the crisis really kind of escalated, what we also do see is a very kind of stringent, very strong action by the government, the central government, and also by the people having a very strict lockdown, having where the people are basically kind of confined for several months to their own homes, and also very high level of compliance within the country to these kind of policies. So we do have these different views on the domestic level. We also have that on the international level, after the situation seemed to be under control within China, we also saw that China tried to open up to actually support other countries. There have been, especially in Europe, they have kind of support deliveries of protective gear and face masks, etc., which have been quite welcomed by some of the countries. But then also there has been criticism about the quality control of these kind of products, and also the concern, especially in Europe and also in the United States, that that China is using this crisis to gain geopolitical advantages. And so we have these kind of ups and downs from an international perspective, how China is perceived in this situation, in the current crisis. And it's really up to debate where this will lead to. At the moment, it seems like China is more on the defensive. In between, it seemed like China is much more kind of leading into becoming an accepted in an accepted position. We don't know, but what we do see is that there is kind of lots of volatility which didn't happen before, and this kind of volatility might create different power structures within the world after the pandemic crisis. I want to kind of, the last thing I want to kind of talk about is that the idea that China is cushioned against economic shocks because of its high level of savings, and therefore it can kind of act more strategically than other countries might be able to do. And there are some truths to that. Of course, the federal or the government reserves are quite big, and China has used these kind of reserves already beforehand in order to steer through crisis. But this shouldn't be overestimated. It can be, in short-term, market corrections can be done, but market forces are also existent in China, and it's unlikely that China can use kind of prevent crisis because of that. However, it is a very useful tool in terms of monetary policy in order to develop their own economy further. And I think also in this kind of COVID-19 pandemic, it is very interesting to observe how China is acting in terms of stimulus of its population, etc. It's not well known yet what exact measures are taken, but it will be very interesting to see what kind of positions the Chinese government does take in terms of redistribution, etc. I think in a way, this kind of implications of rise of China is an interesting question because it highlights something which we had before. Is this how do we see changes on a global perspective, changes in the power structure? Is this kind of, do we need to look at this in the very narrow patterns where China is just becoming a more powerful actor and therefore is threatening its neighbors? Because in a relative power distribution, if China becomes stronger in the region or maybe even in the world, then of course the other actors like Japan, etc., and also the United States become weaker, and they could be feeling threatened by this situation. Or do we rather see this as a development, a domestic development of a country which has a high part, which includes a high part of the global population, leading from relative poverty towards a middle class and maybe even at one point a very kind of a leading economy in the world, but kind of developing that from a national perspective of leading people out of prosperity, like leading people towards prosperity and not necessarily kind of from a position of dominating the rest of the world. That is very much up to the position of the interpretation, and so we do have to. We can kind of see this from the different perspectives. So this is basically kind of looking at this, the implications of this rise as well, and seeing like from a geopolitical, do we think that from a geopolitical perspective that this will have this kind of change will have a real impact or not? And if yes, then we might actually see a change in the global power structure. And I think this pandemic actually, for the first time, shows that there is real movement within the international system, and that we actually might after this pandemic might have a quite different world than we went into it. So I want to highlight at the very end this kind of paradoxical implications of the rise of China. So in the one hand, we can kind of put here two focus points. The one is that the West, or the world's capitalist system, which I call it here, needs China as a last major outpost for global expansion. So it's a place where this expansion can take place, and where it's actually kind of increases the prosperity of the West and Western company as well. But it also threatens this system because it makes it more vulnerable, because it kind of increases the competition of the country. So we do have this at the one hand, the strengthening of the Chinese economy is fueled by Western companies and by the Western economies, which are trying to participate in this kind of development of the Chinese economy. But at the same time, they are threatened. They feel threatened by it because they are worried that China will become too powerful, and therefore also develop. They dominate the political scene. So in a way, we do have a very kind of paradoxical situation, but not all scholars see it in such a negative way. Because like scholars like Joseph Nye said, it's not only like a consequence of economic development, that this also automatically needs to lead to a more conflictual situation. That actually, if this is managed well, and if also not just from the Chinese perspective, but also from the Western perspective, if the focus is on more cooperative and less confrontational issues, that this might actually lead to a situation where both systems can coexist and cooperate with each other, rather than being conflictual and competitive in their nature. So not all scholars see it as negative, but depending on their perspective, they are kind of their theoretical perspective. Often the same events might be interpreted quite differently. Okay, I leave it here for today. This was a little bit an introduction towards our position in how we can see China in the 21st century. In the next class, we will talk about the opposite, the United States and its development. And tomorrow we have plenty of time to discuss this further and go into detail. Until then, I look forward to seeing all of you, and goodbye.
This morning I woke restless and heady, with blood pulsing fierce in the vein. There's light on a line this morning, and maybe forever I move with regard for the sign.